The Etruscans, also known as the Etrurians, are quite a mystery. Their origins are subject to great debate, with their arrival in Italy guessed to have taken place somewhere between 1200 and 700 BC. Aspects of Etruscan culture are of Oriental origin, yet many people believe that they were from Northern Europe. On the other hand, some people believe that they were native to the Italian region that they occupied. They were a people of great mystery, even in their society. They were not a united nation, nor were they like the Greek city-states, who favored a loose confederation of states. They seemed to share little beyond common language, religious beliefs, and practices. They were influenced by both Asian ideas as well as directly influenced by Greek art. One association with the Etruscans was that of being pirates. They were immensely powerful at sea between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, and on land, at one point, even Rome was ruled by an Etruscan king. These spirited peoples took ideas for art from other people, but they were much more than mere copyists, as their art had a strong and brutal character of its own, and they had a choice of subject matter that was quite unlike the Greeks. We're going to start by looking at Etruscan pottery and painted vases. We don't have examples of these in the textbook, but as you can see, they're quite similar to Greek vases, roughly coinciding in time. This is the Centaur and Pegasus by the Macaulay painter. This is a Hydra from Volki, late 6th century BC. The height of this piece is 16 inches. Now, black figure vases of Etruscan origin, such as this image, are highly reminiscent of Greek black figure vases that we've studied previously. This is called Peleus Taming Thetis by the Aurora painter. This is a volute crater from Falerii. Dates around 340 BC. The height is just over 23 inches. Now, red figure technique vases, like this image, are also highly similar or derivative of Greek red figure vases. Both the black and red figure vases occurred about a generation later in Etruscan art when compared to Greek art, and this suggests that the Greeks had a rather direct influence on the Etruscan artists of this time period. Here we have the death of Actaeon on the right and Ajax committing suicide on the left from a calyx crater from Volki dating from around 410 to 400 BC. The height of this vase is 15.5 inches. Now, however direct the influence of the Greeks was, the nature of the Etruscan people came out in their art. Many of the Etruscan vases are of a much more violent nature than that of the Greeks. The Etruscans had a rather rich store of demons, and they used them a great deal in their art. They were of a fundamentally different line of thought than the Greeks. Now, one reason we know so little about the Etruscans is that their language remains largely unsolved to this day. Some of the few words that are known stand for the many superhuman beings that they believed in, and these were apparently a major part of their beliefs, not just decorative motifs as used largely by the Greeks. Now, like pottery, some Etruscan architecture closely resembles that of the Greeks. However, once again, they were not mere copyists. Etruscan temples differed in a number of ways. First, they relied almost exclusively on wood for their construction. Second, for the most part, their temples were much smaller than the Greek temples. And third, this smallness kindled with their propensity for using wood, allowed for greater space between the columns, as their weight-bearing responsibilities were greatly decreased. This is a slide of Vitruvius's Etruscan temple, and the slide here and the plan that we'll look at in the next slide show the distinctions between Etruscan and Greek temples. The Etruscans used an elevated platform that was not employed by the Greeks. That's not seen here. Again, not seen is the fact that the steps or the entrance was only from the front in an Etruscan temple. Now what you can see is that they used a triple cella or naos, so it's not just a centralized cella like we saw that housed the cult statue with the Greeks. Fourth difference is that the porch is rather deep in an Etruscan temple. And the last thing that we'll examine here is that the sides of an Etruscan temple are rather plain. And this indicates that the Etruscans did not share the Greek idea or vision of architecture as large-scale sculpture. When we look again at the reconstruction of the Etruscan temple, you can see how this triple cella plan was adopted by the Romans to house the Capitoline triad of deities. Those were Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. This is a circular tumulus from the 5th century BC. This is an example of the most distinctive Etruscan tomb, the tumulus. This was a round structure that actually held some influence over Roman tombs later on. This slide shows the Banditaccia necropolis from the 7th to the 2nd centuries BC. Now, tombs such as the tumulus, which you see in abundance here, were arranged in what's called a necropolis, or a city of the dead, which probably in some ways mimicked the layout and design of Etruscan cities of the living. This is the burial chamber from the Tomb of the Reliefs from Italy, 3rd century BC. Now, while many of their tombs were circular, the interiors were rectangular. As their houses and temples were constructed primarily of wood, it is these tombs that give us our best indication of what Etruscan homes must have been like. The Tomb of the Reliefs was cut away in living rock, or tufa, as it's called specifically, with its massive piers or squared columns essentially left uncarved for support. Tufa is a soft volcanic ash which hardens on exposure to the atmosphere. Now, Etruscan wall paintings found on the walls of their tombs are among the most spectacular remains of Etruscan art. It is especially appreciated in light of the fact that so little Greek wall painting survived. Mythological scenes, scenes of generally unexpected deaths, and banqueting are common themes in addition to that of athletics. This is the Tomb of Hunting and Fishing from Tarquinia, dates from around 520 BC. Now this painting, very vital and lively, presents us with a rather different approach to art than that of the Greeks. Of great interest in this work is the scene, or is the scale of the figures to the overall scene. This scene is not viewed as focusing primarily on the figures, In many ways, we could describe this as one of the first European landscape paintings. And secondly, what does the artist seem most interested in? You might argue movement, and I can see that point, but I think color is definitely a strong focus. The artist appears to be interested in the expressive nature of color and understands its decorative, in a way, role. This is a profile of a woman, Etruscan, late 4th century BC, a wall painting from the tomb of Orcus, and this is a detail, obviously, also in Tarquinia. Now, some textbooks suggest that this somber face is indicative or reflective of a change in the focus, personality, or even religion of the Etruscans. Most important in this work are two stylistic devices worth examining. First, it represents a very accomplished drawing ability, as evidenced by the eye drawn in profile, as opposed to being shown from the forward view, a sort of twisted perspective of the face that we've almost become accustomed to. Second thing that's really beautiful here is the strong and not symbol-oriented handling of the mouth. Again, this represents an optical advance in the field of drawing and painting. It's also interesting to record the presence of a Roman characteristic or ideal in the face. Now, what is that Roman characteristic here? The bridgeless nose. So while the Etruscans borrowed from the Greeks and Asian cultures, so too would they exercise their own sphere of influence. The preferred media in sculpture for the Etruscans was bronze and painted terracotta, made of earth. The terracotta allowed for modeling figures in clay as opposed to carving from stone. One of these two media is much more suited to an immediacy of thought, and that's the terracotta. Here we have a human-headed cinerary urn from around 675 to 650 BC. Again, it's terracotta, and it's about 25.5 inches tall. Now, this canopic urn is so called because of its similarity to Egyptian urns of the same function. This urn would serve as a memory of the deceased, as well as hold their ashes. And the Etruscans practiced cremation in their burials, if you would like to call it that. This is a sarcophagus from around 520 BC. It's terracotta as well, and is about 6.5 feet in length. Now, this terracotta sarcophagus both confirms and contradicts the importance other peoples had in shaping Etruscan art. The idea of a sarcophagus, that very idea bespeaks an Egyptian influence. Yet the material used is quite different. Also, this sarcophagus is nowhere near as imposing as the Egyptian model. Here's a detail of that same sarcophagus, and the square shoulders of the man and the rounded face of the woman tell of a Greek influence. Yet the expression and the tender theme are wholly Etruscan. I think I'd like one of these for myself when my time comes. This is a sculpture of Apollo from Veii, dates from around 510 BC, terracotta, 69 inches tall. A fellow from Vulca made this Apollo, and this is superb evidence of the apex of Etruscan terracotta. Vulca is the only Etruscan artist that we know by name. Now, some people, some textbooks, suggests that Apollo here was the central figure in a pediment, but I think the next slide is going to show us that it was probably used in a very different manner. This is a reconstruction of the Temple of Apollo from the 6th century BC. Apollo apparently was from the roof of a building and was part of a larger scene in which Apollo pursues Heracles. The Etruscans' use of and development of terracotta as an artist media itself sprung from their using terracotta to protect their perishable wooden buildings from the weather. So here, from a practical use, came an exciting art. This is a sculpture of Mars from Todi, early 4th century BC, bronze, about 4 feet 8 inches high. Now Mars, an early 4th century BC bronze, obviously owes a great deal to Polykleitos of the Greeks in terms of the principle of weight shift. But Mars here is very much unlike the Greeks in terms of his garb, his exaggerated gesture, and his individuality. If you could see all of his head, you might notice that he almost appears ready to speak. In a way, this is less about timeless beauty to be admired, a Greek notion, and more focused on a specific narrative function. The difference between this and Greek sculpture, I believe, is a question of liveliness. Now, belief in and interest in fantastic beasts and demons fueled Etruscan art of great interest. In many ways, the Etruscans were responsible for introducing monsters into Western art. Monsters were largely an Asian or Eastern feature, and we'll see that in the next slide. This is the she-wolf, dating from around 500 BC. It's made of bronze. The height is 33.5 inches. The great interest in the work of the Etruscans can be pointed out in this she-wolf of the Capitol, a magnificent beast which shows ferocity as opposed to human passiveness. This statue was of such interest that the figures of Romulus and Remus were added some 2,000 years later. Romulus and Remus were supposedly the founders of Rome. This is the Chimera of Arezzo, early 4th century BC, bronze, about 31.5 inches tall. Now this Chimera was discovered in the 1550s, and it so excited Renaissance scholars that they were inspired to look once again and more closely at their Etruscan past, as this animal in no way suggests Western associations. While the Greeks moved the cause of art forward, it was largely a cold and calculating sort of movement. The Etruscans borrowed from the Greek legacy, yet gave it a warmth and an energy that it was previously lacking. Now, in contrast to the Greeks, who tried to find a natural explanation for everything, the Etruscans held strong to magical explanations, and these explanations further invigorated their art and separated it from the Greeks. This is an engraved back of a mirror from around 400 BC. It's bronze. The diameter is but 6 inches. The Etruscans understood line and its expressive and descriptive powers. This mirror seems closer in understanding the possibilities of abstract line to modern masters like Matisse than that of the Greeks. If you compare the pattern and the lines here used to Matisse's work, who we've looked at previously in comparison to some prehistoric work, I think you'll see that there's a very strong affinity between the artists. Now, in fact, the Etruscans, who looked back and around for ideas, seemed at their best when they were giving to the future. And we'll see that in the next. Here we have an Etruscan tomb figure of Juno on the left, dating from around 650 to 475 BC, and on the right we have a sculpture by Alberto Giacometti, a Swiss artist who produced this sculpture in 1934. It's called Hands Holding the Void. So the Etruscan sculpture compares quite favorably to 20th century sculpture in terms of the elongation of the figure and even the abstraction of the figure. So, in summing up the Etruscans, one thing that we want to make clear is that the Etruscan interest in expression was far greater than their interest in mere description.